String instruments. Stringed instruments, or chordophones, are musical instruments that produce sound from vibrating strings. In most string instruments, the vibrations are transmitted to the body of the instrument, which also vibrates along with the air inside it. The body of most but not all string instruments is hollow. There are exceptions, such as types of electric guitar which have a solid wood body. With the electric guitar, the guitar amplifier is used to make the vibrations of the strings audible. In the horn-bosstel sax scheme of musical instrument classification used in organology, string instruments are called chordophones. Common instruments in the string family include the violin, guitar, sitar, electric bass, viola, cello, harp, double bass, rebab, banjo, mandolin, ukulele, and bouzouki. String instruments can be sounded using a number of approaches. The classical strings are played pizzicato and using of bow. Guitar family instruments are played with a variety of techniques, including plucking and strumming. History. Some of the earliest stringed instruments have been identified in archaeological digs of ancient Mesopotamian sites, like the lyres of Ur, which include artifacts over 3,000 years old. Lyre instruments with wooden bodies and strings used for plucking or playing with a bow represent key instruments that point towards later harps and violin-type instruments. Moreover, Indian instruments from 500 BC have been discovered with anything from 7 to 21 strings. During the medieval era, the rate by which string instruments developed arguably varied from country to country. Middle Eastern rebecks represented breakthroughs in terms of shape and strings, with a half a pair shape using 3 strings. Early versions of the violin and fiddle, by comparison, emerged in Europe through instruments such as the guitar, a 4-stringed precursor to the guitar, and basic lutes. These instruments typically used catgut and other materials, including silk, for the strings. String instrument design was refined during the Renaissance and into the Baroque period of musical history. Violins and guitars became more stable, in terms of the design changes, and were roughly similar to what we now use. The violins of the Renaissance featured intricate woodwork and stringing, while more elaborate bass instruments such as the bandora were produced alongside quill-plucked chitins and Spanish body guitars. In the 19th century, string instruments were made more widely available through mass production, with woodwind string instruments a key part of orchestras. Cellos, violas, and upright basses, for example, were now standard instruments for chamber and smaller orchestras. At the same time, the 19th century guitar became more typically associated with 6-string models, rather than traditional 5-string versions. Major changes to string instruments in the 20th century primarily involved innovations in amplification and electronic music. Electric violins were available by the 1920s, and were an important part of emerging jazz music trends in the United States. Breakthroughs in electric guitar and basses then saw major breakthroughs in pop and rock music through the middle of the 20th century. The ongoing connection of string instruments to electronic amplification added variety to classical performances, and enabled experimentation in the dynamic range of orchestras, bands, and solo performances. Types of instruments. Construction. String instruments can be divided in 3 groups. Lutes, instruments that support the strings via a neck and about, for instance a guitar, a violin, or a saz. Harps, instruments that contain the strings within a frame. Zithers, instruments that have the strings mounted on a body, such as a gurkin, a cimbalom, and autoharp. or a piano. It is also possible to divide the instruments in groups focused on how the instrument is played. Types of playing techniques. For a full list, see List of string instruments. All string instruments produce sound from one or more vibrating strings, transferred to the air by the body of the instrument. They are usually categorized by the technique used to make the strings vibrate. The three most common techniques are plucking, bowing, and striking. An important difference between bowing and plucking is that in the former the phenomenon is periodic, so that the overtones are kept in a strictly harmonic relationship to the fundamental. Plucking. Plucking is a method of playing on instruments such as the vina, banjo, ukulele, guitar, harp, lute, mandolin, oud, and sitar, using either a finger, thumb, or quills to pluck the strings. Instruments normally played by bowing may also be plucked, a technique referred to by the Italian term pizzicato. Bowing is a method used in some string instruments, including the violin, viola, cello, and the double bass, and the old viol family. The bow consists of a stick with many hairs stretched between its ends. Bowing the instrument's string causes a stick slip phenomenon to occur, which makes the string vibrate. The Ravana hatha is one of the oldest string instruments, ancestors of the modern bowed string instruments of the rebab of the Islamic empires, the Persian Comanche and the Byzantine lyra. Other bowed instruments of the rebec, hardingfell, nickel harper, koku, erhu, igil, sarangi and kni. The hurdy-gurdy is bowed by a wheel. Rarely, the guitar has been played with a bow for unique effects. Striking. The third common method of sound production in stringed instruments is to strike the string. The piano and hammered dulcimer use this method of sound production. Violin family string instrument players are occasionally instructed to strike the string with the stick of the bow, a technique called collegno. This yields a percussive sound along with the pitch of the note. A well-known use of collegno for orchestral strings is Gustav Holster's Mars movement from the Planet Suite. Other methods. The Aeolian harp employs a very unusual method of sound production. The strings are excited by the movement of the air. Some instruments that have strings have attached keyboards that the player uses instead of directly manipulating the strings. These include the piano, the clavichord, and the harpsichord. With these keyboard instruments too, strings are occasionally plucked or bowed by hand. Composers such as Henry Cowell wrote music that requires that the player reach inside the piano and pluck the strings directly, bow them with bow hair wrapped around the strings, or play them by rolling the bell of a brass instrument such as a trombone on the array of strings. Other keyed string instruments, small enough for a strolling musician to play, include the plucked auto harp, the bowed nickel harper, and the hurdy-gurdy, which is played by cranking a rosined wheel. Steel-stringed instruments can be played using a magnetic field. An e-bow is a small handheld battery-powered device that magnetically excites the strings of an electric string instrument to provide a sustained, singing tone. Third bridge is a plucking method where the player frets a string and strikes the side opposite the bridge. The technique is mainly used on electric instruments because these have a pickup that amplifies only the local string vibration. It is possible on acoustic instruments as well, but less effective. For instance, a player might press on the 7th fret on a guitar and pluck it at the head side to make a tone resonate at the opposed side. At electric instruments, this technique generates multitone sounds reminiscent of a clock or bell. String length of scale length. The length of the string from nut to bridge on bowed or plucked instruments ultimately determines the distance between different notes on the instrument. For example, a double bass with its low range needs a scale length of around 42 inches, whilst a violin scale is only about 13 inch. On the shorter scale of the violin, the left hand may easily reach a range of slightly more than 2 octaves without shifting position, while on the bass longer scale, a single octave or a ninth is reachable in lower positions. Contact points along the string. In bowed instruments, the bow is normally placed perpendicularly to the string, at a point halfway between the end of the fingerboard and the bridge. However, different bow placements can be selected to change timbre. Application of the bow close to the bridge produces an intense, sometimes harsh sound, which acoustically emphasizes the upper harmonics. Bowing above the fingerboard produces a purer tone with less overtone strength, emphasizing the fundamental, also known as flautando, since it sounds less reedy and more flute-like. Similar timbral distinctions are also possible with plug string instruments by selecting an appropriate plucking point, although the difference is perhaps more subtle. In keyboard instruments, the contact point along the string is a choice made by the instrument designer. Builders use a combination of experience and acoustic theory to establish the right set of contact points. In harpsichords, often there are two sets of strings of equal length. These choirs usually differ in the plucking points. One choir has a normal plucking point, producing a canonical harpsichord sound. The other has a plucking point close to the bridge, producing a reedier nasal sound rich in upper harmonics. Sympathetic strings. Some instruments are employed with sympathetic strings, additional strings not meant to be plucked. These strings resonate along with the played notes. This system is, for instance, present on a sarangi. Sound production. Acoustic instruments. A vibrating string on its own makes only a very quiet sound, so string instruments are usually constructed in such a way that this sound is coupled to a hollow resonating chamber, a soundboard, or both. On the violin, for example, the taut strings pass over a bridge resting on a hollow box. The strings' vibrations are distributed via the bridge and sound post to all surfaces of the instrument, and are thus made louder. The correct technical explanation is that they allow a better match to the acoustic impedance of the air. It is sometimes said that the sounding board or sound box amplifies the sound of the strings. Technically speaking, no amplification occurs, because all of the energy to produce sound comes from the vibrating string. What really happens is that the sounding board of the instrument provides a larger surface area to create sound waves than that of the string. A larger vibrating surface moves more air, hence produces a louder sound. All lute-type instruments traditionally have a bridge, which holds the string at the proper action height from the fret, fingerboard. On acoustic instruments, the bridge performs an equally important function of transmitting string energy into the sound box of the instrument, thereby increasing the sound volume. The specific design and materials that are used in the construction of the bridge of an instrument have a dramatic impact upon both the sound and responsiveness of the instrument. Achieving a tonal characteristic that is effective and pleasing to the player's and listener's ear is something of an art, and the makers of string instruments often seek very high-quality woods to this end, particularly spruce and maple. Spruce is used for the sounding boards of instruments from the violin to the piano. Instruments such as the banjo use a drum covered in natural or synthetic skin as the soundboard. Acoustic instruments can also be made out of artificial materials, such as carbon fiber and fiberglass. In the early 20th century, the Stroh violin used a diaphragm-type resonator and a metal horn to project the string sound, much like early mechanical gramophones. Its use declined beginning about 1920 as electronic amplification came into use. Electronic amplification. Most string instruments can be fitted with piezoelectric pickups to convert the string's vibrations into an electrical signal that is amplified and then converted back into sound by loudspeakers. Some players attach a pickup to the traditional string instrument to electrify it. Another option is to use a solid-bodied instrument, which reduces unwanted feedback, howls or squeals. Amplified string instruments can be much louder than their acoustic counterparts, so musicians can play them in relatively loud rock, blues, and jazz ensembles. Amplified instruments can also have their amplified tone modified by using electronic effects such as distortion, reverb, or wah-wah. Bass register string instruments such as the double bass and the electric bass are amplified with bass instrument amplifiers that are designed to reproduce low-frequency sounds. To modify the tone of amplified bass instruments, a range of electronic bass effects are available, such as distortion and chorus. Symphonic strings. The string instruments usually used in the orchestra, and often called the symphonic strings, are violins, violas, cellos, double basses. When the instrumentation of an orchestral work is said to include strings, it very often this combination of string parts that is indicated. Orchestral works rarely omit any of these string parts, but fairly often will include additional string instruments, especially harp and piano. In the Baroque orchestra, harpsichord is almost always used to play the basso continuo part, and often a theorbo or lute. In some classical music, such as the string quartet, the double bass is not typically used. The cello plays the bass role in this literature.